There is this very specific, universally recognizable kind of anxiety that just hits you the second you walk into an apartment viewing.
Oh, absolutely. It is a completely visceral reaction.
Right, like you step over the threshold and your shoes are either, awkwardly clicking on the hardwood or worse, you've been asked to take them off.
Yes. The socks. You're just padding around in your socks.
Exactly. You're sliding around in your socks, trying to look incredibly responsible and mature.
Holding your little folder of documents.
Yes, holding a folder, maybe a notepad you brought to look prepared. And you just get this overwhelming, almost physiological feeling that you are auditioning.
You're auditioning for the right to simply exist in that empty space.
Totally. The landlord or the leasing agent is standing there, arms crossed, maybe tapping their foot. And suddenly, your brain just completely flatlines.
You forget every single thing you were supposed to be evaluating.
Right. You're just standing there hoping they pick you. But what if we've got that entire dynamic completely backward?
Well, it's the absolute definition of a high-stakes, low-information environment. Human beings naturally crave clarity,
We really do. We want to know the rules of the game.
Exactly. We like to walk into a transaction knowing exactly who holds the leverage. But in that empty room, the power dynamic feels incredibly opaque.
Yeah, it feels like all the power is entirely on their side.
And usually, because of the nature of what is being negotiated, it heavily skews against the person looking for a home.
Which is exactly why we are doing this today. Whether you are, prepping for a move right now, trying to help a friend navigate a relocation, or you're just curious about the subtle power dynamics of real estate, this deep dive is for you.
And we are looking at some truly fascinating source material today.
Really are. It's an excerpt from something called the Essential Apartment Inquiry Guide. And a bit of context here for you listening. This guide is actually framed around an English podcast lesson.
Right. It's explicitly designed as an educational tool for language learners.
Yeah, to teach them how to ask the right questions to landlords. But when you look at the core of what it's teaching, the principles are universally applicable to anyone signing a lease.
Honestly, the fact that this originates as a language learning tool is actually what makes it so revealing.
How so?
Well, when you are learning how to operate in a new language, you don't start with abstract philosophy, right? You start with absolute survival mechanics.
Oh, that makes sense. Like, where is the bathroom? How do I buy food?
Exactly. How do I acquire food? How do I ensure I have shelter? This source material strips away all the aspirational fluff of real estate marketing.
No one is talking about the granite countertops or the exposed brick.
Right. It gets right down to the structural reality of tenancy. It focuses entirely on the fundamental boundaries you have to establish before you sign your name to a legally binding document.
And then that is our mission for this deep dive. We aren't just going to, read off the guide's list of questions like a checklist.
Because a checklist doesn't actually teach you the underlying strategy.
Exactly. We are going to examine the underlying mechanisms. We're going to look at why the specific inquiries highlighted in our source material, rent inclusions, pet policies, and lease terms, are the absolute bedrock of a tenant's risk management strategy.
And then, crucially, we're going to look at how to practically apply this.
Yes, using a very specific high-pressure scenario provided right in the text.
Because understanding the theory is completely useless if you lack the behavioral tools to execute it in the room.
You can read all the guides you want, but if you freeze up in front of the landlord, it doesn't help you.
Right. The goal here is to analyze how a prospective tenant can shift from, a passive applicant hoping to be chosen into an active negotiator structuring a bilateral agreement.
So let's jump in. The source guide specifically subtitles its focus as asking the right questions to landlords. And this brings me right back to that empty echoing room I mentioned at the start.
The audition room.
The audition room, yeah. I've always compared an apartment viewing to a high-stakes job interview. You show up, you're dressed a little better than usual, you hand over your resume.
Which in this case is your credit score and your bank statement.
Right. And you just hope you say all the right things so the boss hires you. But if we are the ones bringing in the capital to the table, paying the rent every month, why do we default to this subordinate posture?
It really comes down to how we subconsciously process information asymmetry and resource scarcity.
Okay, unpack that a little bit for me.
Well, shelter is a physiological necessity, right? Therefore, the entity providing the shelter always appears to operate from a position of absolute authority.
Because they have the thing we literally need to survive.
Exactly. The landlord possesses the scarce, tangible asset. You, the prospective tenant, require that asset. So the default assumption in your brain is that they hold all the cards.
But the guide is arguing that's not actually true.
Right. If we look at the actual mechanics of a lease, it is a mutual exchange of value.
It's a business transaction.
Yes. You are purchasing the exclusive use of an asset for a set period. And in return, you are providing the landlord with necessary liquidity and asset utilization.
Meaning they need our money just as much as we need their space.
Precisely. Adopting that job interview mindset means you are volunteering to surrender your agency before the negotiation has even begun.
Wait, hold on. I completely get the theory of mutual exchange, but let's be real about the market for a second.
Okay, let's look at the reality.
In a highly competitive rental market, right? If I walk into a viewing and start aggressively interrogating the landlord, aren't they just going to toss my application in the trash?
That is everyone's immediate worry.
Yeah, because doesn't asking a barrage of structural questions actually risk losing you the apartment to the next guy in line who just, smiled, nodded, and asked 0 questions?
That is the most common fear, but it is a fundamental misunderstanding of how risk is perceived by an asset manager.
Really? So landlords don't want the quiet, compliant person.
Well, there is a massive difference between being antagonistic and establishing a baseline of competence.
Okay, I see.
If a landlord perceives a polite, direct question about basic financial terms as being difficult, you have just successfully identified a massive red flag.
Oh, wow. So if they get mad that you're asking about the lease, you probably don't want to live there anyway.
Exactly. A professional, reputable landlord expects these questions.
But why would they actively prefer the person grilling them over the person who is perfectly compliant and just signs whatever's put in front of them?
Because the compliant person who asks no questions is a wild card.
A wild card. How so?
They might be agreeable today, standing in the empty room, but they haven't demonstrated any understanding of the contract they are about to enter.
Ah, so they might be shocked by a rule later and stop paying rent.
Right. A tenant who asks precise questions about structural liabilities is a tenant who is thinking critically about their own solvency and their ability to fulfill the contract.
That makes so much sense.
By asking the right questions, you are actually signaling to the landlord that you are a lower risk investment. You reduce their uncertainty.
Okay, that completely shifts the perspective. You go from being a passive consumer to an active auditor. But, knowing you need to ask questions is really only half the battle.
You have to know what to actually ask.
Right. You have to know where the actual pressure points of the contract are. You can't just walk in and ask, when was the last time the gutters were cleaned?
No, because that doesn't actually impact your daily operational risk as a tenant.
Exactly. The source material outlines specific critical highlights, and the very first item it flags is rent inclusions, specifically focusing on utilities.
And it prioritizes utilities for a very specific economic reason.
Let's get into that, because the guide calls out rent inclusions right at the top. We all know the base rent is the big number flashing on the online listing.
It's the headline figure.
Right, it's $1,500 a month or whatever it is. But if utilities are essentially just the operational costs of the building, the water, the electricity, the trash, why is the guide treating this as the paramount question you must ask?
Why not just assume you pay them?
Yeah, isn't it just standard operating procedure that tenants pay for their own power?
It is far from standard, and the variation is exactly where the financial danger lies.
Okay, break that down for me.
What the guide is addressing here is essentially the problem of risk transference. The listed base rent, that $1,500, is a fixed cost.
It's highly predictable. I know exactly what I owe in the first of the month.
Exactly. But a human being cannot inhabit an empty, unpowered box.
Right. We need heat. We need lights.
The utilities, the heating, the cooling, the water, those are variable costs. They fluctuate dramatically based on usage, seasonal changes, and macroeconomic energy markets.
So the question of rent inclusions isn't just a basic checklist item. It's really a question of who is holding the bag when external factors change.
Precisely. If a building is master metered, meaning there is only one meter for the entire property, a landlord might include utilities in the base rent.
Which sounds great for the tenant.
It is. In that scenario, the landlord is absorbing the risk of a harsh winter or a sudden spike in natural gas prices. You, the tenant, have total financial predictability.
But if the utilities are not included,
then the landlord has successfully offloaded the volatility of the energy market entirely onto you.
And if you don't establish that boundary up front, before you sign, you are essentially signing a blank check.
You really are.
You budget for that $1,500 fixed cost, but you are totally blind to the variable cost. You might move in and discover the windows are drafty, the heating system is super inefficient, and suddenly...
Suddenly you're on the hook for a $300 gas bill in January.
Exactly. And your carefully constructed budget is just completely destroyed.
The source material emphasizes this point because utility structures can be incredibly opaque.
What do you mean by opaque? Like hiding fees?
Well, sometimes landlords use third-party billing systems that divide the building's overall utility usage by square footage, regardless of your individual consumption.
Oh, wow. So even if I never turn on my heat, I'm paying for the guy upstairs who keeps his apartment at 80 degrees.
Exactly. If you don't ask what is included, and more importantly, how the exclusions are calculated, you are exposing yourself to unlimited financial liability.
That is terrifying.
Asking about rent inclusions is your first line of defense against what we call the base rent illusion.
The base rent illusion. I like that term.
It's the marketing tactic of advertising only the fixed cost while intentionally hiding the variable operational costs.
It's risk management, pure and simple. You have to know the real number, not the fake marketing number.
Absolutely.
Okay, so establishing the financial boundaries of the utilities is the first major takeaway from the guide. But the source material moves beyond just the monthly cash flow.
Yes, it shifts gears significantly.
The next two highlights, pet policies and lease terms. Shift the focus from the purely financial to what dictates your actual lifestyle and your timeline in the space.
We are moving from risk mitigation to structural rigidity.
Right. Let's look at pet policies first. On the surface, asking about a pet policy seems, I don't know, almost trivial compared to negotiating utility liabilities.
It seems like a simple yes or no.
Yeah. If you have a dog, you ask if dogs are allowed. If they aren't, you leave. Why does the guide elevate this to a top-tier inquiry alongside the financial architecture of the lease?
It is elevated precisely because it is one of the few truly binary non-negotiable clauses in a standard lease agreement.
Meaning there is no gray area.
Exactly. Utility costs can be budgeted for.
Wow.
Even a somewhat high rent can be managed by cutting expenses elsewhere. But a pet policy represents an absolute barrier to entry.
You either can live there or you can't.
Right. From a contractual standpoint, we have to look at the inherent conflict of interest at play between the two parties here.
The clash between property preservation and the tenant's actual life.
Yes. To the prospective tenant, a pet is not a piece of property, It is a family member.
Of course. It's inextricably linked to their mental health and their daily routine.
But to the landlord or the property management conglomerate, a pet is simply a quantifiable risk factor.
Just a line item of potential damage.
Exactly. It represents a higher statistical probability of flooring damage, noise complaints that could drive away other tenants, and of course potential liability issues for their insurance coverage.
So if the landlord views the pet purely as a liability and the tenant views the pet as completely non-negotiable, why not just read the listing?
You mean why ask in person?
Yeah, why does the guide insist you explicitly ask the question during the inquiry phase? Doesn't the listing usually say no pets?
Because listings are often incomplete, outdated, or intentionally vague to maximize the number of applicants walking through the door.
Oh, right. They want foot traffic.
Exactly. A listing might say, pets negotiable. Well, what does that actually mean? Does it mean dogs under 20 pounds?
Does it mean cats only?
Does it require a massive, non-refundable deposit that completely changes your budget?
And if you just assume it's fine and wait until the lease is drawn up to clarify this,
Yeah.
you have wasted immense time and leverage.
The guide highlights this because failing to ask the question up front forces tenants into terrible, terrible situations.
Like what? What happens if you don't ask?
Well, you end up either abandoning your housing search really late in the game, or you attempt to hide the pet.
Which is a complete disaster.
It's the worst possible outcome.
If you try to sneak a pet in, you are willfully breaching the contract from day one. You just live with this constant low-level paranoia.
Every time you hear footsteps in the hall.
Exactly. You're
Yeah.
terrified that a maintenance worker is going to come in to fix a sink, see a dog bowl, and you'll be slapped with an eviction notice.
Right. So asking the pet question early, directly to the landlord's face, forces them to define their vague negotiable terms into concrete reality.
It defines the lifestyle boundary immediately. You know exactly where you stand.
You do.
Which leaves us with the final major highlight in the source guide. Lease terms. Now, I have to admit, this is the one where my eyes usually glaze over.
A lot of people feel that way.
Right. A lease is a lease. You sign for 12 months. It feels like boilerplate legal text. Why do we need to interrogate the landlord about the lease terms before we even apply?
Because treating a lease like standardized boilerplate is exactly how people get financially trapped.
Trapped.
Yes. A lease term is not simply the duration of your stay. It is the entire framework of your temporal commitment and the penalties associated with altering that commitment.
Okay, give me an example of that. What's the real danger in just assuming it's a standard one-year contract?
The danger lies in life's inherent volatility.
Life happens, basically.
Exactly. A standard 12-month lease provides you with the stability of a fixed housing cost. The landlord cannot arbitrarily raise your rent in month 6.
Right, which is the benefit to the tenant.
But that stability comes at the cost of your liquidity and mobility. What happens if you lose your job in month 4?
Or what happens if you get a phenomenal job offer in another state?
Exactly. What happens then?
I mean, I assume you just break the lease and lose your security deposit. That's what everyone thinks, right?
And that is a very, very dangerous assumption.
Wait, really? It's not just the deposit.
In many jurisdictions, if you break a lease, you are legally responsible for the rent for the remainder of the term, or at least until the landlord finds a replacement tenant.
Oh, wow. So you aren't just risking a one-month deposit. You could be risking thousands and thousands of dollars in liability.
Yes. When the guide tells you to ask about lease terms, it is telling you to investigate the exit strategy.
You need to know how to get out before you get in.
Exactly. Does the contract have an early termination clause? Are you permitted to sublet the apartment to mitigate your losses if you have to move?
Ah, I see. So you are probing for the flexibility within the contract itself.
You are. And you are also probing for what happens at the end of the term.
Right, month 12.
Does the lease automatically renew for another full year if you don't give 60 days notice?
Oh, those auto-renew clauses are brutal.
They are. Or does it transition to a month-to-month agreement? And if it goes month-to-month, does the landlord retain the right to increase the rent with only 30 days warning?
Which completely destroys that fixed cost stability we talked about.
Exactly. The lease term defines how rigidly you are bound to the property. If you don't ask these questions, you are allowing the landlord to dictate your future mobility entirely.
It's fascinating when you lay it out like that. We have these 3 distinct boundaries the guide tells us to establish. The financial boundary of the utilities, the lifestyle boundary of the pet policy, and the temporal boundary of the lease terms.
It covers every vector of risk.
It really does. If you secure answers on those 3 fronts, you've effectively mapped out the actual reality of living in that space, way beyond the cosmetic appeal of the viewing.
You have transitioned from evaluating the physical aesthetics of the property to evaluating the structural integrity of the contract.
But, and this is where the rubber really meets the road, this is my absolute favorite part of the source material.
The practical application.
Yes, because it is one thing for us to sit here in a studio and intellectually analyze the importance of risk transference and bilateral contracts.
It's very easy to be brave in theory.
Exactly. It is entirely another thing to be actually standing in that room, heart-pounding, trying to execute this negotiation with a stranger staring at you.
It is incredibly stressful.
The guide doesn't just leave us with abstract theory, it provides a highly specific practical scenario. It introduces us to Bruce.
Yes. The scenario is brilliantly constructed precisely because it forces the transition from theory to immediate action.
Let's read the exact scenario from the text so you listening can picture this. The text says, Bruce is looking at a flat and has to ask if the utilities are included in the price.
It's just one sentence.
It's one sentence, but there is so much to unpack there. Before we even get to Bruce's actual strategy, the specific vocabulary used in the source material really stands out. The text explicitly uses the word flat instead of apartment,
which immediately anchors the scenario in its intended context.
Right.
The use of flat is primarily British English, though it's widely adopted in various international real estate markets, whereas apartment is predominantly used in North America.
And why does that word choice matter so much for our deep dive?
We have to remember that this guide originates from an English language learning podcast. It is targeting individuals who are likely navigating complex legal and financial negotiations in a foreign country.
Or at the very least, in a language in which they are not entirely fluent.
Exactly.
That context adds an immense layer of pressure. I mean, it's hard enough to advocate for yourself in your native language when the power dynamics are skewed against you.
It's terrifying for native speakers.
Imagine trying to process the cognitive load of a real estate transaction, calculating exchange rates, understanding local utility norms, while simultaneously translating your thoughts and ensuring your tone isn't culturally offensive.
The cognitive load is staggering. You are managing so many variables at once.
It really is.
And yet, the fundamental mechanics of the negotiation remain exactly the same. The language barrier simply amplifies the need for absolute precision.
You can't talk your way out of it.
Right. When you are operating with limited linguistic bandwidth, you cannot rely on charm or small talk or highly nuanced phrasing to get the information you need. You must rely on structural efficiency.
Which brings us right back to Bruce. He's standing in this flat. He knows his budget. He remembers the rule. He must establish the financial boundary regarding the variable costs.
The utilities.
Right. The prompt says he has to ask if the utilities are included in the price. Put yourself in Bruce's shoes for a second. The landlord is finishing their pitch about the great natural light. Bruce has to interject. How does he actually phrase it?
The phrasing dictated by the guide is incredibly specific, and it is the crux of the entire exercise.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, notice what the prompt does not say. It does not say Bruce should ask, could you tell me a little bit about how the utilities work here?
Or like, what do people usually pay for utilities in this building?
Exactly.
Why are those questions bad? They sound polite. They sound, conversational and friendly.
They are conversational, but functionally they are open-ended questions.
And that's the problem.
In a negotiation where there is a massive asymmetry of information, an open-ended question is just an invitation for deflection.
Oh, I see.
If Bruce asks, what do people usually pay for utilities? The landlord might just respond with, oh, it's a very energy-efficient building. The costs are quite reasonable.
Which sounds comforting, but gives Bruce absolutely zero actionable data.
None.
Reasonable is entirely subjective.
Yeah.
What's reasonable to a guy who owns 10 buildings is not reasonable to me.
Exactly. It is legally and financially meaningless. It allows the landlord to maintain the base rent illusion without actually committing to a hard figure.
They get to sound helpful while giving you nothing.
Yes. But the guide instructs Bruce to ask if the utilities are included in the price. By structuring the inquiry this way, Bruce is utilizing a closed question.
He is forcing a binary response.
He is cornering the landlord into a yes or no.
He is demanding a commitment to a specific reality. Are the utilities included in the price?
Yes. If the landlord says yes, Bruce has successfully neutralized the variable cost. His financial boundary is completely secure.
And if the landlord says no?
If the landlord says no, the ambiguity is destroyed. Bruce now knows the base rent is an illusion, and he can immediately pivot to the necessary follow-up analytics.
Like, okay, which specific utilities are excluded? Are they sub-metered? What is the historical average cost for this specific unit during the winter months?
Exactly. He controls the flow of information now.
The genius of the Bruce scenario isn't just the linguistics, though. It's the behavioral courage it demands from the tenant.
It takes real nerve.
Think about the physiological stress of that moment. Bruce has to actively interrupt the social flow of the viewing. He has to risk making the interaction slightly tense.
He has to be willing to be the difficult one.
And that is so incredibly difficult to do when you're overriding biological imperative in that moment. It's just to secure shelter.
You just want them to like you.
Right. You are terrified that if you demand a binary answer, the landlord will view you as adversarial and just reject your application.
But we have to return to our earlier point about signaling competence.
Right. The asset manager mindset.
Yes. Asking a direct, closed question about financial liability does not make you adversarial. It makes you a professional.
You are showing them you understand the contract.
A landlord who bristles at a closed question regarding utilities is a landlord who relies on ambiguity to maintain their leverage.
So Bruce's direct question acts as a dual-purpose tool.
How so?
Well, it secures his financial boundary, but it also acts as a stress test for the landlord's transparency.
That's a perfect way to put it.
If the landlord dodges the yes or no question, you have your answer right there about how the next 12 months are going to go.
Precisely. If they cannot give you a straight answer about the water bill before you even sign the lease, imagine trying to get them to fix a broken boiler in the middle of February.
It would be a nightmare. It's a massive paradigm shift. By channeling Bruce, you aren't just protecting your budget. You are actively interviewing the landlord.
You are flipping the script of the entire viewing.
You are reclaiming your agency in the transaction.
Which is the entire point of the exercise.
This has been incredibly illuminating. We started with a simple excerpt from an English language lesson about renting an apartment. But by looking closely at the mechanics of what the guide is actually teaching, we've uncovered a highly sophisticated framework for navigating power, risk, and boundaries.
The principles of self-advocacy are universal,
Yeah.
regardless of the language they're taught in.
They really are. So if we synthesize the core insights from this deep dive for you listening, it really comes down to a few critical shifts in perspective.
First, you have to recognize and dismantle the default power dynamic of the empty room.
Yes, you are not a subordinate begging for a favor. You are a party entering into a bilateral contract, and you bring necessary value to the table.
Second, you must proactively establish the structural boundaries of that contract before you commit to anything.
You must pierce the base rent illusion by forcing clarity on the variable costs of utilities.
Yeah.
You have to establish the hard lifestyle boundaries regarding pet policies to avoid future breaches of contract.
And you must deeply examine the lease terms to understand your true temporal liability and your exit strategies.
And finally, you have to execute. You have to internalize the Bruce scenario.
You have to actually speak the words.
Right. You cannot let the social pressure of the viewing intimidate you into asking soft, open-ended questions that just invite deflection.
You have to find the courage to ask the direct, closed questions that force a binary commitment from the landlord.
You have to demand the data you need to protect yourself.
Mastering these seemingly mundane interactions, asking about a submeter or a pet deposit, is fundamentally an exercise in risk management.
It's about protecting your downside.
It is about insisting on transparency in a market that frequently profits from your hesitation.
Insisting on transparency in a market that profits from your hesitation. I think that perfectly encapsulates the entire mission of the guide. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over.
Something to think about before your next viewing.
We've talked extensively today about the mechanics of these questions. We ask about the utilities to mitigate financial volatility. We interrogate the lease terms to protect our mobility. We clarify the pet policies to preserve our daily lives.
We do all of this to protect our downside risk.
But think back to that feeling of stepping over the threshold into that empty, echoing apartment. When we relentlessly question landlords about what is included, when we demand clarity and establish our boundaries, are we simply trying to protect our monthly spreadsheets? Or, in having the courage to demand these answers, are we actually taking the very first necessary steps in trying to turn someone else's property into our own sanctuary?